Merton and self-discovery. And in the handout that you have the blue one, you have a little bit of sense of who we're talking about. He's a 20th century monk and was a Trappist at Gethsemane and wrote a famous book called Seven Storey Mountain, and wrote a lot of things about spiritual life and contemplative prayer and so on. And he, later on in his life, as we'll see, then traveled to the east. That's going to bring us up to what we're talking about tonight. But just so what is a 20th century figure, monk, Trappist, and a mystic, spiritual writer, and so on. So what we did in the first class, there are handouts in the back for anybody who wants those for this lecture tonight. What we talked about in the first section was the movement from the false self to the true self. So Merton, the whole thing is to talk about self-discovery. Merton, to see how Merton can help us get in touch with who we are, to function more effectively, and so on, understand ourselves better. So he says, first of all, that we live with a false self very often. That's illusion. We don't understand ourselves. We don't know who we are. We rationalize, and so on. And so Merton thinks that prayer, contemplative prayer, is very helpful in getting to our true self. So that if we can be quiet and be close to God and deepen our prayer life, then we will be able to move from this false self closer to the true self. And so we talked a lot about prayer and contemplation and Merton's great invitation to us to try to improve our prayer life. So as I said last week, evidently no one was here to hear. Anyway, I was talking about the fact that Merton, wherever we are, gives us a little nudge, so that if we say 3 Our Fathers, that's the extent of our prayer. He says, well, why don't you talk to God a little bit in your own words? If we're using a lot of words, he says, well, why don't you use fewer words and just be in God's presence? And then maybe beyond that, there's other ways to deepen our prayer by becoming more open and receptive to that presence of God. So that was a movement from the false self to the true self. Now last week, we talked about the movement from the external self to the inner self. That is, that Merton says that a lot of times in life we deal with others through facades, through masks. That we often are not true to ourselves and we do what other people want us to do, or we pretend, or we are involved in hypocrisy and so on, and that what we've got to do is to learn how to move towards representing our inner self, our inmost self, what we truly are, and interacting with other people on that basis rather than through facades. And Merton believes that if we indeed enter our personal relationships in a healthy way, and if we understand all of that properly, then we'll be able to do that better, interact on the basis of our inmost self rather than these facades or external selves. So that's what we tried to take up last week, and we talked a lot about the advice that Merton would give us in trying to make this kind of improvement. I think he really has a lot of important things to say, and try to look at that a bit. Now, before I launch into what I want to talk about tonight, I want to take up a question that I've done each night, and that is, what is the source of the fascination of this fellow? Here he's 20 years after his death, and we are approaching the anniversary of his death. December 10th, 1968 is when he died in Bangkok, Thailand. So 20 years later, we've got a lot of people coming to lectures about him, and we have a lot of books being written and so on. He's obviously a fascinating person. And I've tried to offer various explanations of why that might be. One part of it is that he is an honest searcher, and therefore he appeals to us. And he's able to write about that search. I want to just read to you a little bit of from one of his journals. A Vow of Conversation is the title of this journal. And it's, I think, revealing about the man. So Merton asked his abbot, Dom James, to be able to go to an important meeting up in Collegeville. And a lot of the big theologians were going to be there. Father Herring and Barnabas Ahern and Godfrey Diekmann, the great liturgist, invited him. It would be great to go there and be with all those people. So he asked the abbot, and the abbot, in fact, there was no discussion of why, but he just says you can't go. Doesn't give him any reason. So Merton's just writing this all down. says Dom James, the abbot, regards this invitation to Collegeville as a personal threat to himself, to his prestige, to his very existence as father image and icon. If he were invited, he would probably attend. After refusing my Japanese permission, he himself took off for Norway. I'm sure he is not aware of this himself. It appears to him only in the most acceptable terms. He thinks my humility would be deflowered by this meeting with experts. He goes on to name them. Well, I have to learn to accept this without resentment. Certainly not easy to do so far. I've hardly tried, to tell the truth. It angers and distracts me. So that is the vow of obedience. You submit yourself also to somebody else's prejudice and to his myths and to the worship of his fetishes. Well, I have made the vow, and I'll keep it, and we'll see why I keep it, and try at the same time not to let myself be involved in the real harm that can come from a wrong kind of submission. There are several wrong times, and the right time is not always easy to find. In other words, I do not agree with those who say that any submission will do. Now, writing a few days later, I must admit that over Sunday I was troubled by the whole business of that refused permission. Father Abbott preached a long, impassioned sermon on vanity, ambition, and so on. And I could see he was still very upset. There was a great deal of emotion. His voice was trembling. His breathing was not altogether under control. Obviously, this had something to do with my request. This is the way he usually operates, and I thought it was quite unfair if it was. I too was irritated and finally depressed, sitting there in a position of total helplessness and unable to respond or do anything about it. The feeling of powerlessness and frustration, and most of all, humiliation over the fact that I should feel it, so much, and be forced by my feelings to think about it all day. How absurd. Well, he goes on and says, yet the efforts I made to see it rationally, to see it as trifling and laughable, would not quite come off. I mean, you can see he's got this thing, he can't get it out of his head. Nor did the religious arguments and the repeated acceptance of it as a cross and humiliation the depths of my will. That didn't help either. Nothing seemed to make any difference. And finally, I lay awake all night. First time this has happened in the Hermitage. At last, I wrote a note to him saying I was sorry that I had offended him, that his sermon had made me miserable, but that my writing was not pure ambition and vanity at all. So obviously there is some vanity involved in it. And that I wish he would accept me realistically and not expect me to be something I can never be. He replied that the sermon had nothing to do with me. That he had no intention of hurting me and was most concerned for my welfare. Maybe it was an illusion. But anyway, there it was. And I was relieved that it was all settled. A tantrum. I am surely old enough to be on that. I don't really believe his reply. Well, there's our friend Thomas Merton struggling with his inner psyche over this terrible thing the abbot has done to him, refusing to let him go to Collegeville. I think that's one of the reasons he's popular. I mean, because of his utter honesty in dealing with his feelings. I suppose most people can identify with that kind of inner struggle. And maybe that, when we hear about Merton, then we think, well, my own struggles aren't all that strange or unusual. And besides that, he says it all so well. But you notice the self-critical attitude. I could treat it. Some people don't like a lot of reading like that. There's going to read another one. I mean, he is so self-critical. Is another one I'll abbreviate a little bit. All day I've been uncomfortably aware of the wrong that is in me. The useless burden of pride I condemn myself to carry, and all that comes with carrying it. I know I deceive myself as a monk and as a writer, but I cannot catch myself in the act. That's a neat phrase. And I know I deceive myself, but I can't catch myself doing it. I do not see exactly where the deception lies. Perhaps it is a question of trying to do things that are beyond me, or trying to have something to say about everything. I do not have enough mistrust of my own opinion. Beyond that, there is my rebellious and nasty dissatisfaction with everything. With the country, with the church, with the monastery. Although not so much with the monastery right now. I'm accepting it more peacefully, so on. Well, he goes on, he says, I'm trying... He goes on with other things that he's upset about here. He's impatient with the Pope. He's impatient with the government over Vietnam. He's impatient with biographies of new cardinals. He's impatient with everything. So, there's our man, Thomas Merton. So he does need help here, and he gets his help. He turns to the east. That was the topic for tonight, after a little bit of feel for maybe why he is of interest to us. So tonight we want to talk about a movement not from the false self to the true self, and not from the external self to the internal self, but now from what Merton might call an excessive self-consciousness to a self-forgetfulness. So that's the major movement, and he wants to let the wisdom of the East, from China and from Buddhism, Eastern religions, to help us to move in that direction. Again, we look at Merton to see how he might help us along this particular path. Now, there's a couple of major ways, it seems to me, that this excessive self-consciousness, as he calls it, might afflict us. The first one is excessive introspection. It is to be, in Merton's phrase, in the bondage of the ego. Be a slave to the ego. Now, how might this all work out, or how might we end up doing all of this? Well, one thing might be to be excessively concerned about our motivation. We always be asking ourselves, is my motivation pure? Did I do this for a good reason? Do I have a cause for the feelings that I have? Be always looking within, checking it out, and sort of, in that way, not getting on with life. So that excessive introspection here and checking out motives. Another way this could happen is what we commonly call scrupulosity. That is, people too worried about sin. You might find Merton in that category there, where he's sort of looking within it. Something I'm doing wrong. I must be doing something wrong, but I can't catch myself at it. I surely am wrong. Certainly something wrong with me here. So that this excessive worry that whatever I'm doing is wrong, and it's not in God's favor, and that I may well be punished or go to hell for the whole thing. Third, again, this is all under the heading of excessive introspection, turning inward too much or in faulty ways. Third way is trying too hard to get in touch with ourselves. A lot of the self-help movement might be along that line. You know? I don't know what's going on. I got to know every emotion. Got to really vent everything. That's the idea. Every emotion's got to come out. And it's the kind of thing of almost people need to see their strength too often. Got to go to the strength to the psychiatrist. Too often in a way. To always make sure that I'm on the right track. So that in general, Merton would say a lot to try to do too hard effort to grow into spiritual life is going to defeat us. Spiritual life isn't a matter of gritting your teeth and working really hard at it. As we'll see, he tries to learn from each a different way of going about all of that. Fourth, and maybe this begins to overlap a bit, an excessive concern about self-fulfillment, self-actualization, achieving and making progress in life. So that one is so worried about purposes and accomplishing and so on that one really can't ever enjoy what is happening now. One is always sort of on edge and worried about, am I making it? Am I making this kind of progress? Am I becoming a better person? Am I better than I was yesterday? And not able to, as a result, to just go with the flow and enjoy whatever is happening in the moment. Next, to be inordinately aware. Now, I know some people like this. I suppose one of the paradigmatic figures in this regard would be Tolstoy, the Russian novelist. Tolstoy was evidently aware of everything. He couldn't help but notice everything. And he noticed all of his feelings and everything around him. He was too much in touch. It's like there's too constant a flow of images, too many thoughts. It all gets jumbled and confused. One can't hang on to any part of it. So it's just all, the mind is just sort of racing all the time. It gets very anxiety-producing. And it begins to bother people. I personally don't have that problem, but, some people's minds, they're so fertile, it's going all the time like this. And they can't shut them off. Other people can't sleep at night like that. They have to keep a pad by their bed to get all these brilliant ideas down and so on, so that they don't lose any of that. Evidently, I don't know, I remember reading a review recently of a new biography of Tolstoy talking about at the very end of his life, he sort of had to bolt from his familiar surroundings and get off, go someplace else, out where the peasants were, so he could simplify things and stop his mind from working and begin to sort of zero in and quiet himself and so on. Next, the temptation to use drugs to extend consciousness, to improve the inner life. Again, we saw it was Timothy Leary, his drugs became a sacrament, drugs became a way of expanding consciousness, of having highs. I think I've said this before, Abraham Maslow, the great psychotherapist, humanistic psychologist, thought that by playing up peak experiences so much, these great moments, almost religious type experiences where it was all peaceful and together, that he had created a whole generation of people who had to have those, had to have these highs. And if they couldn't get them naturally, then one had to turn to drugs to make that happen. Now, so that's under the general heading of being too introspective, too turned in. And I suppose some of us would find ourselves more in that category, maybe by nature. We're just sort of prone to be that way. We can worry about little things, worry about small slights. I think it's a function of temperament very often, and just the way we are. And I think sometimes there's education involved that makes people overly scrupulous. I think sometimes our religious background and training emphasizes part about checking out our motives and so on, that it becomes almost habitual that we are too turned in like this. Then, the second major area that might go wrong in this idea, where we have this self-consciousness out of control, has to do with more cultural kinds of problems. And the way that culture programs this self-consciousness. One way this happens is in terms of saying that we will achieve the proper self-consciousness and self-importance by acquiring things. That's one of the titles of Merton's book on this whole topic, is Zen and the Birds of Appetite. Birds of appetite being an image for what goes on in the Western world of this appetitive desire, going to have more things, acquisitive nature. That's the way we're going to sort of get ourselves in order. And then a second way that I think that goes wrong, especially in the Western world, is the emphasis put on secondary activities rather than primary ones. That would be, for example, to say the important thing is to have gone to church rather than to be there and to pray. It's like to go to a museum, not for the purpose of seeing the paintings, but so that one can tell someone, I visited the Louvre, or I was in the Museum of Modern Art. One doesn't really care about what goes on while one's there. It is the retelling of it that becomes important. To be able to share this with others, tell others about it. It could be the putting too much of an emphasis on theology rather than faith. Theology is a second-order activity. It is to reflect upon faith. But then to say, boy, theology is really where it's at. That's where my interest is. And to neglect faith, which is the primary thing of living in a close relationship with God. So we could probably spell out that whole thing. Almost any activity in life can be used in that way. It just is a means to be able to do something else, to be able to talk about it, or to say that I have done it, or to create some sort of an image with others. And what happens, of course, in all of that is that the consciousness of the moment of being able to enjoy whatever is happening never occurs. And I think there's something about our culture that really moves us in this direction, that it causes this to happen. Thirdly, under the way the culture affects the self-consciousness, is Merton's whole analysis of suicide, which I find to be very interesting in the light of recent things I've read, and I might even have talked about it in here, and that is the work of Martin Seligman on depression, who talks about, why we have a great increase of suicide, especially among young people, and why depression is increased tenfold in our culture. And Merton's analysis, is very similar to what we are seeing today. And he's talking about suicide now among the affluent, not among those people who would have reason for, their socioeconomic status and so on to be down on life. But this is among people who sort of have it made. And he says what happens is the culture says that you can have it all. In fact, we've got ads right now that play to that theme, don't we? I don't really recall what it is, but the line is, who says you can't have it all? And then it even gives you the interplay, a couple of things. Who says you can't have it all? Why can't you do this and that? And Merton says, that is extremely destructive, because what it sets up is the notion that we can have it all, and in our affluent culture we often can. We can get more things, but what we can't get are the things that are most important to us. We can't guarantee ourselves things like respect and love and a sense of meaning in life, and a feeling of fulfillment and purpose. And Merton says what happens is when we get to the culture keeps telling us you can have it all, and then we come to those things and we seem to be able to have them, but we don't know how to get them, and there isn't any way really to get them. And when that dawns on us, you can't make someone else respect you. You can't make someone love you. You can't manufacture meaning in life. When that becomes clear to people, then they feel trapped. They feel closed in, and there's a sense of no way out, no exit, as Sartre says. And so then the absurdity of life begins to take over. You can't buy it. Can't buy those things through any means, through asceticism, through self-help books, through religious exercises. Nothing brings those kind of things. And when that happens, then the no exit sign is off, and then suicide very often becomes the out, or at least Great Depression can take over. I find that to be extremely insightful analysis, and something that very often I think only a monk or somebody who can stand back from the culture and look at it from a distance is able to see that sort of cultural interplay. All right, that's my sense of the question here that we're involved in. Excessive self-consciousness, false self-consciousness. Self-consciousness has gone astray because of the culture in which we live. And what we're going to see is that Merton's response to that is his turn to the east. So I'd like you to take just a minute or two now and see if you can get into the problem, if any of that resonates with you, because Merton can't answer unless it's real, unless it's an existential question for us, unless we can feel the problem in ourselves in some way or another, then we can't really follow him in his journey to the east. So why don't you try and see if you can't work your way into the problem and share that with somebody else. So I would say when introspection gets in our way of living spontaneously, that would be one problem. So one is sitting around trying to figure out if my motive was proper and the chance to do something good passes. Example. Or then too much turned inward and therefore I fail to notice the needs of people around me. So I would say when it messes up our behavior, that's one thing. And sometimes that seems to me to be very obvious. if I'm in a paralyzed state and can't make a phone call that I should make because I'm too turned inward, well, then, I know I should have made the phone call and I didn't do it. So that would be one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is that if it becomes a distraction to being involved in the moment, like for example, sometimes we're talking to people and we're really not paying any attention to what they're saying because some other inward thing is going on. I got some other inner dialogue going on. That's very noticeable. We can catch ourselves doing that a lot of times. I would say that's another time when it gets in the way. A third comment I would make on that is that it's a problem when it doesn't have a reference point, when it's just closed in on itself. An example of that would be Augustine's Confessions. Augustine's Confessions are very introspective. He looks at himself very intently. So does Merton in his journals and his writings. But it has another reference point. The reference point for them is God. And so that God is brought into the picture. It's not merely an inner dialogue, but something else is going on. And I would say without that reference point, too much introspection is almost always going to be psychically dangerous for us. So I guess my general thought is that we need to know ourselves. There's some people who would say, I'm in a rat race. I just do and be and go and so on. I haven't looked within in 32 years. I just am not into that. Well, that's to know ourselves again. It's one of those dialectical situations where two things needs to go on in our life, and that is we need to be reflective people, but we need to live spontaneously. I call that dialectical virtue reflective spontaneity. So that what I'd like to do is do as much reflection and inner work as will help me to live more spontaneously, to go with the flow, and to live without much thought, to live so that I know which of my emotions I can trust and which of my intuitions prove to be on target. That's in my reflective time. I need to learn that so then I can just go live. So the person who's figured out they don't have a drinking problem because they check themselves out can then go and drink whatever they want at a party and not worry about it, not make it a big thing like, wow, I got to be careful tonight. You don't have to do that. Someone else who knows they have a drinking problem, then they got to be smart enough. That reflective time moves them, programs them to be careful when they go to the party. So it seems to me that's part of knowing ourselves. So I like the virtue of reflective spontaneity in which my busy, active life throws me back on periods of reflection, introspection, and then that is done not for its own sake. That's done so that one can go ahead and live more spontaneously, more freely, more liberated. That's the way I would like to see it work positively. Reflective spontaneity. So think about that and see if that helps. Let's go on to look at our friend Thomas Merton now. Even those who have not been here in the other two classes, by reading the blue sheet, you get a little bit of a sense of his life, when he was born and his early troubles with his mother. That's what I did last week, is talk about his relationship with his mother, which left him always searching for the feminine the rest of his life. The relationship with his father, who died when he was 16. Merton's mother died when he was 6. So very traumatic experiences for him. He felt often homeless because he didn't have a place like that. So we looked at his early life and his relationships also with his brother John Paul, who was 3 years younger than himself. And with John Paul, his major sense was that he had offended him, that he was insensitive to him earlier in his life. And so he thought of that whole relationship on the model of the Cain and Abel story. And Thomas Merton thought of himself as Cain, the one who had sort of killed off his brothers and kept them at a distance and wouldn't bring him into the playtime when they were youngsters and so on. So all throughout his life, he had real trouble dealing with that relationship. And unfortunately, his brother John Paul was killed as a flyer in the Second World War and died, and prompted some of Merton's more those tender poetry and deeper feelings about his brother. So, I mean, and then he lives in New York, and he goes to Columbia University, and he leading the good life there, and a rather dissolute life in many ways, and decides to go to the monastery, become a Trappist, and write Seven Storey Mountain, and so on. So, I mean, that's, the general story of his life, and those relationships really are crucial and important, and one way of getting a feel for what Merton was all about. Tonight we want to look at that story from the viewpoint of the Eastern influence on Merton. And I would say, we got to remember Merton is thoroughly westernized. He grows up in England and the United States. He's Western education, typical male in our culture, all of those things. But he began, I'd say, early when he was at Cambridge, he began in England going to school, and not very successfully, as you know. He didn't make good grades and sort of wasted a marvelous opportunity in his life. But he did start reading a little bit, dabbling in Eastern religions. When he came to Columbia, he read a little bit along that same line. And then in 1938, while he was doing his graduate studies at Columbia, he did run into an Eastern monk, a Hindu monk, who had come to the United States about 5 years before that, sort of became Americanized and got a doctorate from Chicago and all that. But Merton ran into him, and you got this scene in New York where they're gathering for bull sessions over a beer and so on, and he gets a chance to pick this guy's brains, find out some things about Eastern thought. And after going through all this, the guy says to him, he says to him, "What should I read?" He says, "Well, what you should read is Augustine and the Western Mystics." Very good advice, I think. In other words, the guy, the Hindu monk, was telling him, you better get in touch with your own tradition first before you start reaching out and looking at other traditions. So, with all of that, Merton went to the monastery and tried hard to live the life of a good monk, and it exhausted him physically and mentally. He couldn't really give up his writing as he tried to do, and felt the need to get back to it in some way. And along the line, he had all these troubles with Abbot Fox. Abbot Fox was a Harvard graduate, a business major who wanted to straighten out the monastery financially. And Abbot Fox gave him a lot of trouble. And one of the worst things he ever did to Merton was he let him go to Collegeville on one occasion. In fact, he encouraged him to do so. But he arranged for him on that occasion to meet with a certain psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Zilborg. And Dr. Zilborg got to Merton, and it was all a plot on the part of the abbot. And the abbot sort of prompted the psychiatrist. I mean, really a terrible kind of thing when you think about it. But he got him into conversation with Merton, and the psychiatrist proceeded to tell Merton that he was nothing but an exhibitionist, and that his writings were not much better than babble. And that what he really ought to do is, if he wanted a hermitage, is go and put it on Times Square and put a sign above it. That's about how much he was really interested in being alone and serious about being a monk. Well, it devastated Thomas Merton. I mean, it really cut into his ego. It cut into his self-respect. It just really did him in psychically. And I mean, one could see what a horrible thing that is to do to another person. Now, I don't know what the cause-effect with this is. That occurred in 1956. And Merton really needed a time of healing after that, which he went about. And part of his healing, again, I'm not saying cause-effect here, but was this business of starting to look more deeply into the Eastern religions and studying Chinese thought and Zen Buddhism and so on. Began reading the Zen masters pretty strongly. He tried to learn Chinese. He really wasn't able to do it. He had to abandon it finally. One of the few, I suppose, intellectual failures that he had in his life. He did start to read the Chinese writers in translation, especially Chuang Tzu, and he later wrote a book, The Way of Chuang Tzu, which is sort of a free interpretation of Chuang Tzu's thought. It probably tells us more about Merton than it does about the greatest Eastern philosopher probably that ever lived, Chuang Tzu. Anyway, we're going to talk extensively about this book and what Merton had to say about that and what he learned from the Chinese. The other big thing that happened to him was in 1959, I think it was, that he began to correspond with D.T. Suzuki, who happened to be the reigning expert on Zen Buddhism. He was born in Japan, taught in a lot of major universities. He was the most important interpreter of Zen Buddhism for the West. And Merton typically, as I told you before, he corresponded with 1,800 people. And often it wasn't just one letter. In fact, there's about 11 pages in his collected letters of just his side of the correspondence to Suzuki, which he carried on over a number of years. And finally, in 1964, 2 years before Suzuki's death, he had come to New York as an old man in his 80s, and Merton again got permission to leave the monastery, go to New York, and have a personal interaction with this great Zen Buddhist scholar. I was looking through the letters that they exchanged, and I just bring out a couple of things that I thought was of import in what he had to say. He told Suzuki that he had read a bit of Alan Watts. Now, that's been the entree for many people in the Western world into Eastern thought through Alan Watts, who was a Westerner but wrote intelligently about the East. He told Suzuki that he saw a lot of connection between the Zen masters and the Desert Fathers, especially the spiritual joy that they were able to come by in trying to overcome sufferings and difficulties in life. He tells Suzuki about sitting out outside the monastery, and he looks across and he finds a bluebird sitting on a fence post. And the bluebird suddenly dives down to try to catch a wasp, but it misses, returns to its position on the fence post, and sits there as if nothing had ever happened. And Merton tells Suzuki, here I was able to get a brief lesson in Zen by observing that. Well, if that doesn't make sense to you, which obviously it doesn't to many people, it will before the night's over. That's the joy of discovery. Learn. Before the night's over, say, oh, I know why he told Suzuki that. Now that was a brief lesson in Zen. You see the bird? No. And he apologized to Suzuki for the way the West had treated the East. He said, it's terrible way Christians from the West go to the East and think all they can do is try to convert those people instead of going there and trying to learn. Talks about, he was from Japan, he talks about Nagasaki and Hiroshima. At one point he says, Americans don't really understand this whole thing of Zen, even though they're into it. He says Americans don't know the difference between Satori, which is the enlightenment experience, and in Zen Buddhism, they don't know the difference between Satori and being dead drunk. So he wasn't too happy about those people who dabbled in Zen in the United States in the 60s and thought they were getting into something. He talks about Meister Eckhart, the 14th century Rhineland Dominican mystic, who he saw as a bridge point between the East and the West. Talked about how important it was to have a simple lifestyle, a simplicity of spirit if we were really going to make it. And finally, he tried to do a little refocusing of Christian doctrines. He was trying to tell Suzuki how he understood Christianity, although his first letter began something like this: I don't really understand Zen Buddhism. This is Merton talking. But then on the other hand, I don't really understand Christianity either. So part of his dialogue with Suzuki moved him to go back and try to reinterpret, refocus his Christian tradition. When he did so, he thought that he could see parallels, especially the idea that we got in the West of God above God. That is, a God who is bigger than any of the images we have, or any of the words we have about a God that transcends all of that, God that's ineffable, unspeakable, that we can't really describe or know. And he says our sacraments, in a way, are like Buddhist koans. Koans are sayings like the common one everyone has heard is, what's the sound of one hand clapping? Or what did your face look like before you were born? And the purpose of Buddhist koan is to break people out of an ordinary way of thinking and force them to look deeper into things. And Merton thought that our sacraments really function the same way as Buddhist koans. That is, they try to point to some deeper mystery. They try to get us in touch with something that's beyond the ritual, beyond the words. So he was trying to help Suzuki understand Christianity and at the same time maybe improving his own grasp of all of this. And then, as we move towards the end of Merton's life, as you can see, he was a restless sort. He always was looking for solitude. He was always searching, looking for new experiences in life. It's remarkable how much he knew and was in touch with the world, although he lived in a monastery. He moved to a hermitage away from the rest of the monastery where he could get quiet and have solitude. But when he got there, people kept visiting him, and as often at his own request. And so he was always looking like, where am I going to find this? And how am I going to get it together? And how am I going to finally get some integrity and authenticity in my life and get beyond these deceits? Get beyond this illusion that keeps following me around. And so he was always saying, well, I'll get another hermitage. I'll get one in Alaska or go out to California. And part of his dream was to go to the East. Go to the East. He dreamed of that. And finally the opportunity came. The Benedictines were sponsoring a conference for monks from all over the world in Bangkok, Thailand. And they invited him to come and give one of the talks. And with great trepidation, because he usually was refused every time he asked to go someplace, asked the abbot, and by some strange happenstance, the abbot said that he could go for a little while. And so then Merton kept entering into constant negotiations how he could spread out this trip. Go earlier and come back later. Go to not only to Thailand but to India. Go to the Himalayas and visit the Dalai Lama. Finally go to Japan on the way back and get more in touch with that Zen tradition and so on. So he kept this, he wouldn't quit, and he just wanted more and more this opportunity to go to the East. So finally the permission was granted, and he got a good deal of time to do that. He left in, this is now 1968, we're moving close to his death, and he left on October 15th. Started recording all this. We got this in writing, the Asian Journal. Wherever he went, whatever he did, he was always writing it down. He was a compulsive writer, and so we got all of his feelings as he's going through this journey. And he said, when he leaves, he said, I am going home. I'm going home to a place that I've never been before. Going home to a place I've never been before. As you'll see, his most important religious experience of his whole life will happen when he goes to the East. So he takes off, and he gets to Bangkok. He travels on, goes to Calcutta, to New Delhi, to the Himalayas. He visits all the monks he can talk to. He tries to learn their wisdom, asks them how they meditate and what the deeper experiences of life are all about. Takes copious notes, reads books as he goes along. Has 3 sessions with the Dalai Lama, representative of Buddhist tradition, and really picks his brains. They have these marvelous, deep conversations about how you come closer to the deepest levels of consciousness. And the Dalai Lama is very skilled, although he's a young man at that time, 33 years old, I think. But Merton's very taken with him, very mature in the spiritual life. And then he finally he goes to Sri Lanka, where he has his greatest religious experience, and I want to talk more extensively about that. Goes to Bangkok in Thailand, December, gives a lecture on Marxism and the monastic traditions. It's well received by all the other monks there. He has some lunch with some people. He says he's feeling tired. He goes up to his room, takes a shower. His feet are evidently still wet, walks along the terrazzo floor. Theory is that he reaches up to either move a fan or to turn it off. It had defective wiring, immediately electrocuted him. He falls down on the bed. The fan falls on top of him, and he is dead. They find him, tell the people in the monastery. It takes about 5 days to come back. Great irony, he's flown back in an army bomber, a SAC bomber, that image appeared often in his writings. When he was in Louisville, the sack bombers used to fly over the monastery, and he was brought back in one, and was buried at Gethsemane in Kentucky. I suppose one of the amazing things about his funeral was all the people who came all thought they were sort of his best friend or knew him better than anybody else. When they got there, they all found out there were all these other people who were his best friend. And everyone knew him in a different way. As with many rich and complex persons, there's the multifaceted personalities that touch people in different ways, and the other person assumes that maybe that's the whole of their personality, not realizing the richness that's there. And so that was a great shock to many people. December 10th, 1968, Merton died. And I don't think that he really thought about dying like that. I don't think so. Coming now as a springboard to the next section of what I want to say is to describe the great religious experience he had when he was in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was called then. And I want to read this to you. And we've got to keep in mind we're dealing with this restless soul who's been searching and trying to get it together all these years and having all these difficulties. And he goes to his famous shrine to the Buddha. And I mean, it might be nice if we had pictures, but here they have these gigantic Buddha figures in this city in central Sri Lanka. I mean, I don't really know how tall they are, but they're like carved into mountains. I mean, they're great big things. And so I want to read this to you and ask you to listen. And part of it is on your handout, but so you can go back to it. But I want to try to give the feel for it. He's really looking forward, and this is what he wants, is to visit this place. So he begins to go up the path, and he writes about this later on. A low outcrop of rock with a cave cut into it, and beside the cave, a big seated Buddha on the left, a reclining Buddha on the right, and Ananda, that was Buddha's closest disciple, a cousin, and he took care of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, through the last 25 years of his life. The Buddha lived to be quite old and lived a rather serene existence that way. So Ananda is his great disciple, and he's carved there with him. And then he says, in the cave, another seated Buddha. Then the guy he was with, shying away from the paganism of this whole event, hangs back, sits under a tree reading a guidebook. So that leaves Thomas free to approach the Buddhas barefooted and undisturbed, my feet in the wet grass and the wet sand. Then the silence of the extraordinary faces of these gigantic figures, the smile, huge and yet subtle, filled with every possibility, questioning nothing, knowing everything, rejecting nothing, the peace not of emotional resignation, but of sunyata, that means like emptiness, that has been seen through every question without trying to discredit anyone or anything, without refutation, without establishing some other argument. So when he looks at the Buddhist figures, and that very often happens to people, they have this great serenity about them. They give the feeling of togetherness and so on. He says, for the doctrinaire and the mind that needs well-established position, such peace, such silence can be frightening. Some people get in that situation and to be scared. He says, I was knocked over with a rush of relief and thankfulness at the obvious clarity of the figures, the clarity and fluidity of shape and line, the design of the monumental bodies composed into the rock shape and landscape, figure, rock, and tree, and the sweep of bare rock sloping away on the other side of the hollow, where you can get back and see different aspects of the figures. So he really worked his way into this. And then comes the great religious experience of his life. He says, looking at these figures, I was suddenly, almost forcibly, jerked clean out of the habitual half-tide vision of things and an inner clearness, clarity as of exploding from the rocks themselves became evident and obvious. So it's almost like a classic Buddhist experience of enlightenment. From within, this flush of clarity. Because the queer evidence of the reclining figure, the smile, the sad smile of Ananda standing with arms folded, much more imperative than Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, because completely simple and straightforward. So he makes the comparison with our Western world. Because the thing about all this is that there's no puzzle, no problem, and really no mystery. All problems are resolved and everything is clear, simply because what matters is clear. The rock, all matter, all life is charged with a deeper force. Everything is emptiness and everything is compassion. I don't know when in my life I have ever had such a sense of beauty and spiritual validity running together in one aesthetic illumination. Surely with this whole experience, the Asian pilgrimage has come clear and purified itself. I mean, I know and have seen what I was obscurely looking for. I don't know what else remains, but I have now seen and have pierced through the surface and have got beyond the shadow and the disguise. It reminds me of Martin Luther King when one of his last speeches when he said, I've been to the mountaintop now and I've seen, and it's all right with me. It's all right with me now because I've seen. It's all clear. It's the deep religious experience of having this sense of unity with God and the oneness of things. I don't know what remains now. I've seen. I've pierced through the veil. I've come to some sort of integration that I've been searching for all my life as part of the way I would interpret it. This is Asian in its purity, not covered over with garbage. It says everything. It needs nothing. And because it needs nothing, it can afford to be silent, unnoticed, undiscovered. And he goes on. So, I mean, we have, for Thomas Merton, I mean, a truly great moment in the spiritual quest, mediated by the figures of the Buddha. I mean, it raises certain questions right away, and one of those that Merton didn't have a very good theoretical answer to, but the notion that God can speak to us through many vehicles. I mean, some people, could be disappointed that Merton's great religious moment wasn't mediated by Christ, or, doing the Stations of the Cross, or seeing a famous painting of Christ, or encountering some artwork like that. That isn't the way it happened. It was mediated in a different way by the East. And so one of the great things that Merton teaches us in all of this is the importance of encountering another culture, another religious tradition, the power that they have to bring us closer to the one God. The theological principle behind it seems to me, is that all things are potentially revelatory, and everything in this vast world of ours, creation, works of art, other people, all of that can bring us closer to the Lord. So Merton, in his own guts and his own being, had a great openness to whatever was happening in the world, and whatever was around. Because he would achieve that kind of openness, he often without a theory to go with it, he was able to mine the riches of this great religious experience. So it opens up immediately this idea, if we're going to look to the East with Merton, what can we learn? We need to do it with the kind of openness, I think, that he eventually arrived at. This is the same guy, when he wrote Seven Storey Mountain, considered the Eastern religions to be paganism. He was just like that guy who was with him there, who wouldn't go in and look at the Buddhas, sat under the tree because he didn't want to get contaminated. Merton was like that himself when he wrote Seven Storey Mountain in the 40s. Here he is 20 years later now, much more open to the Eastern world. Now, I want to first turn to his whole experience with the Chinese humanism, and with his encounter with Chuang Tzu, considered by many, Suzuki included, to be the greatest philosopher ever produced in the Eastern world. And to do this, I think we need a little bit of background if you're going to understand what I'm going to read. I'm going to read some of Merton's reinterpretations of Chuang Tzu, and I don't think we can understand them without some background, so I'll try to do this rather briefly. The Chinese have a distinctive sense of reality, as we might begin to understand. It's often imaged by the yin-yang symbol, which is a circle, half of which is dark and half of which is light, called the yin-yang symbol. And the yin-yang symbol tries to point out that life really is composed of not opposites exactly, but things moving in different directions, but that they can be harmonized. It's a complementary duality. I could play that off against the other major worldviews in the world. Our sense of reality would be much more of a conflictual kind of dualism. In other words, we sense that things are often in conflict. We sense our lives very often that way. I want more independence, but I got to be a good member of the community. And they seem to be at cross purposes very often. So we have what I call a conflict sense of dualism. And in India, in the Hindu world, for example, they have a sense of the unity of everything. All of the differences are really illusion. They are maya. They don't really count. So that would be a third world view, a general way of looking at reality. So in China, the yin-yang suggests that there is a complementarity of opposites. Put it this way, in that kind of mental framework, an aggressive feminist movement would make no sense. That wouldn't be the way you would work the whole thing. Those kind of conflicts simply wouldn't enter into the picture in authentic Chinese thought. And the yin-yang symbol is really, goes back to the deepest sort of roots of what Chinese thought is all about. Then the next thing that maybe we need to know to get a feel for this, and I better cut this down a little bit, and that is Taoism. That's spelled Taoism. T-A-O, and it's pronounced Taoism. All these things, like the famous writing in Taoism is the Tao Te Ching. Some people know that important work from the 3rd century B.C. Well, anyway, in Taoism, their idea really is to play out this whole yin-yang thing. That you got to try to live in a harmonious way. That you got to be in touch with the Tao. The Tao is the major principle, the universal principle that stands behind everything. It's like for us, the God above God. Okay, now, one of the great figures in Chinese thought that played this out was Confucius. Confucius was born around 550 B.C., died around 479. Famous figure, everyone has heard the name Confucius. Well, Confucius, working out of that whole sense of the Tao, worked out an ethical system and a governmental system where everything would be properly in order. And his followers became pretty rigid in carrying that out. And they had all these rules for how you were to act and so on. Okay, now that much you need to know the background. Now Chuang Tzu comes on the scene. Chuang Tzu died around 280 B.C., something like that. So he's quite a time now after our friend Confucius. But Chuang Tzu is now an opponent of Confucius. He's the one who thinks that the followers of Confucius have gotten off the track. And we'll begin to see why Merton likes Chuang Tzu so well. And I realize some people have heard these before, but it's all right. These kind of parables and stories can be heard more than once. And I think they're worth hearing. The first one is entitled Three Friends. And I'm going to break this down a little bit. The three friends were discussing life. One said, can men live together and know nothing of it? Work together and produce nothing? Can they fly around in space and forget to exist? World without end? The three friends looked at each other and burst out laughing. They had no explanation. Thus they were better friends than before. In other words, the friendship came together on sort of the shared not knowing. You'll see that's an important part of it. Then one friend died out of this group. Confucius, got to know the background, Confucius sent a disciple to help the other two chant the official funeral liturgy. The disciple found that one friend had composed a song. The disciple of Confucius found that one friend had composed a song. While the other played a lute, these two fellows sang. Hey, Sung-Hu, where'd you go? Talking about their friend. Hey, Sung-Hu, where'd you go? You have gone where you really were, and we are here. Damn it, we're here. Then the disciple of Confucius burst in on them and exclaimed, May I inquire where you found this in the official rubric for funerals? You're carrying on with this frivolous caroling in the presence of the departed? The two friends looked at each other and laughed. Poor fellow, they said. He doesn't know the new liturgy. That's my favorite one, all downhill. Well, you immediately see that one of Merton, what's the point of all these things? Merton is saying that, what gets in our way. Remember that one of the problems was how ritual or theology gets in the way of somehow having a proper consciousness. So what Merton is saying here is, liturgy can get out of can be off the track. He liked Chuang Tzu because he understood that the ethical system of Confucius had gotten rigidified. It was now, didn't really do the job anymore of expressing what people wanted to express. The system isn't working. The official liturgy isn't working. So one has to go to another thing that's tapping the deeper sentiments of the time. Okay? So, Merton obviously has a feel for this, but the point is, it's part of the answer for Merton to our problem of getting in touch with experience, of letting it flow from inside and not being programmed from the outside. Here's another one of these. These are freely composed, as I said. The South Sea King was, this is his name now, Act on Your Hunch. It's a neat name to have, Act on Your Hunch. The North Sea King his name was Act in a Flash. The king of the place between them his name was No Form. Now, South Sea King and North Sea King used to go together often to the land of No Form. No Form treated them very well. So they consulted together and they thought up a good term, a pleasant surprise for No Form to show their appreciation to him. Men, they said, people, human beings, have 7 openings for seeing, hearing, eating, breathing, and so on. But No Form has no openings. Let's make him a few holes. So after that, they put holes in No Form. 1 a day for 7 days. And when they finished the 7th opening, their friend lay dead. Lao Tan said, to organize is to destroy. And that's a touchstone for some people's lives. To organize is to destroy. One of the things that Merton tries to make clear is that Chuang Tzu is not just an anarchist or a libertarian or a hedonist. There's a strong feeling behind this whole philosophy of Chuang Tzu of the need for discipline, and that just no form without any discipline wouldn't really make any sense in this philosophy. That you have to work hard at things and there's a proper preparation for things, but you can overly organize and overly program, and thus what happens is you shut off your ability to respond from the inside and to drink reality in. So that part of the problem with self-consciousness is that it organizes our perceptions too quickly. And when that happens, when we organize too quickly, then we don't hear what is said. This happened on my radio program last Sunday night. Evidently, there were a number of irate people who chose to call up to express their upset. However, I said nothing that need upset them. I was talking about the movie The Last Temptation of Christ. And my guess is, although these all came to me secondhand, other people had to field these calls, but I was conveniently gone. What my guess is that, they latched onto something said early on, like maybe, well, we could learn something from this movie, Last Temptation of Christ. And if they disliked the movie and thought you shouldn't go see it, then whatever else I said probably didn't mean anything. Or that would be typical of the kind of response you get like that, but that's not just to say about those people. That'd be easy for all of us to do. That is, have preformed judgments and never really allow the reality to make an impact on us. To organize mentally, to have too many grids through which we drink in reality means we miss a lot of what's going on. Can't ever hear anything new if we filter it always through our own categories. Can't process new data, can't move forward, can't advance in any way. Now the next one of these is pretty straightforward. It says, when an archer is shooting for nothing, he has all this skill. If he shoots for a brass buckle, he's already nervous. If he shoots for a prize of gold, he goes blind. Or sees two targets, he's out of his mind. I think we said the golfers in a skins match might think like that. Standing over a putt for $270,000 or something, the hole might narrow a bit to one looks at it. His skill has not changed. No, but the prize divides him. He cares. He thinks more of winning than of shooting. And the need to win drains him of power. Interesting commentary on the cultural side of all of this, of what Merton was after. In other words, part of what he thinks in our acquisitive culture becomes competitive. One has to beat the other person. And then when we have to beat the other person, then we divide ourselves. When we can't live cooperatively, we live as half people. And the need to dominate and control, therefore, ends up causing all kinds of difficulties. Eventually drains us of power. We're not empowered by our relationships. So I see this as a critique of the cultural side of what we were looking at the beginning. The acquisitive society produces competition, the competitive spirit then drains us of power because it divides ourselves. Think more of the need to win dominates our thinking, and we cannot deal effectively with what is happening. Then let's look at the more positive side of this and the image of how he thinks that we ought to live. This one's entitled Cutting Up an Ox. Fairly long, but I think that stay with it. Prince Wen Hui's cook was cutting up an ox. Out went a hand, down went a shoulder, he planted a foot, he pressed with a knee, the ox fell apart. With a whisper, the bright cleaver murmured like a gentle wind, rhythm, timing, like a sacred dance, like the mulberry grove, like ancient harmony. Good work, the prince exclaimed. Your method is faultless. Method, said the cook, laying aside his cleaver. What I follow is the Tao, which is beyond all method. When I first began to cut up oxen, I would see before me the whole ox, all in one mass. After 3 years, I no longer saw this mass. I saw the distinction. But now, I see nothing with the ox. My whole being apprehends. My senses are idle. The spirit, free to work without plan, follows its own instinct, guided by natural lines, by the secret opening, the hidden space, My cleaver finds its own way. I cut through no joint, chop no bone. Get a feel for what he's doing. It all flows spontaneously. A good cook needs a new chopper once a year. He cuts. A poor cook needs a new one every month. He hacks. I have used the same cleaver 19 years. It has cut up 1,000 oxen. Its edge is as keen as if newly sharpened. There are spaces in the joint. The blade is thin and keen. When this thinness finds that space, there is all the room you need. It goes like a breeze. Hence I had this cleaver 19 years, as if newly sharpened. True, there are sometimes tough joints. I feel them coming. I feel them coming, he says. I slow down. I watch closely. Hold back. Barely move the blade, and whoop, the part falls away, landing like a clod of earth. Then I withdraw the blade. I stand still and let the joy of the work sink in. I clean the blade and put it away. The prince said, "This is it. My cook has shown me how I ought to live my own life." So there we get the ideal that Merton is shooting for. Not self-consciousness, but self-forgetfulness. Doesn't even have to look anywhere. Doesn't have to think, where do I plant my foot? Just dawned on me why I can't hit a golf ball. Too much thinking. Too much left brain activity. No wonder I can't hit the ball. No, this guy doesn't have to look. He doesn't have to think. It all flows. Goes easily, spontaneously, and it all works right. That's the sort of ideal that Merton would get out of Chuang Tzu about how life ought to be lived. That gets back to the reflective spontaneity I was saying before. Whatever practice the guy had, however he examined his work at one time, it was all for the purpose of being able to use the blade so it lasts 19 years. It just all goes in rhythm and easily. And of course the point is that's how life ought to be. How we ought to try to live life. That is to get away from self-consciousness, where the thinking and the left brain get in the way of going with the flow and being effective. This is one that Merton probably meditated on after his encounter with the abbot. It was all upset that I read you to begin with. This is called the empty boat. If a man is crossing a river and an empty boat collides with his own skiff, even though he be a bad-tempered man, he will not become very angry. But if he sees a man in the boat, he will shout at him to steer clear. If the shout is not heard, he will shout again and yet again and begin cursing. And all because there is somebody in the boat. Yet if the boat were empty, he would not be shouting and not angry. If you can empty your own boat, crossing the river of the world, no one will oppose you. No one will seek to harm you. Has a lot to do with this sort of emptying out of ego. You go back to the thing I read at the beginning, Merton's ego was hurt, wasn't it, by the abbot. The abbot wouldn't let him go, but there's all kinds of other things at work there. He was hurt. The abbot wouldn't let him go, and therefore he couldn't sleep. Therefore he was upset. He let all of that bother him. He couldn't pray right for a long period of time. And I think that what we're seeing here is a way around that, of reducing the ego consciousness and traveling lighter, sort of letting life be and come at us the way it might. Well, those are some of his interactions with Chuang Tzu, and I think that those stories if we let them work on it, sort of remember them, they probably would take us back to the particular problems they talked about at the beginning and help us to deal with them, especially the cultural problems of being acquisitive and having too high of expectations and so on. One of the things that Chuang Tzu kept saying was that we have to accept life on its own terms. We have to sort of just go along with it all. The wise person just doesn't get carried away with all of that. Doesn't need to win, doesn't need to accomplish, and doesn't need to get any place. They're able to just be at ease with things. Okay, now I want to, let me just see if there's any questions. I'm going to talk about what he got out of Zen Buddhism now and next. Does anybody want to comment on the Chinese side of this? And I don't know if we got, the story should give a feel for it. I don't know if we need to elaborate more or not. Be in touch with the Tao. That's what Chuang Tzu says. Don't just be like Confucius, follow the ethical principles and order everything properly. That isn't the way to do it. There's a deeper thing that you need to be in touch with, and be in touch with what we would call God and the power of the Spirit. If we can let the Spirit flow through us, then we will function better. We'll be like Mozart, to be vehicles of the Spirit. You know, whatever our talents and gifts, then we'll function more effectively. Okay, let me say something about his turn to Zen Buddhism and what we might get out of all of that. Again, a little bit of background. Buddhism starts with the great founding figure known as Siddhartha Gautama, 6th century B.C. The 6th century B.C. was a marvelous period in the history of the world. We did a little meditation for our parish on the prophet Jeremiah, linking him with the great prophets of the time, Confucius and Siddhartha Gautama. I mean, it was a time unparalleled in history for spiritual enlightenment and enrichment. Just Karl Jaspers, the existentialist philosopher, calls it the axial period in history, the turnover period, the key moment in time when so much was happening and this deep enlightenment was going on. Well, anyway, Siddhartha Gautama is living in the same general period. And he has his own enlightenment experience. He sits under that. They're trying to figure out the problems of life, why they're suffering. He asks everybody, tries everything, can't figure it out, sits under the Bodhi tree and has this great moment of enlightenment. Now he sees what life is all about. He sees the world as it really is. He doesn't know if he should tell anybody or not. He goes along and he walks with his disciples and he decides, I will tell them. And he shares with them what are called the Four Noble Truths. And he tells them, life is indeed pain. That's life. Old age, suffering, death. Life is pain. And what causes the pain of life is craving. Wanting, that acquisitive spirit, the birds of appetite. That's what causes the pain. You want what you can't have. Want too much. Therefore, you're upset and frustrated. So, what's the secret to life? How do you handle life? Well, one answer is to get more stuff. But Buddha says that's not the way you do it. What you do is reduce the craving. Cut down on what you want. Cut it all away. Get rid of all the craving. And then he taught them in the Fourth Noble Truth how to do that. And one of the ways to do it is to meditate. Get your focus clear. You cut through those desires. So there we've got the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha. Now you begin to see why what Merton saw when he went there were these gigantic figures, and what touched him about them was the serenity. They didn't need anything, he said. The East doesn't need anything because it's quiet as the heart. Cut down on the desire. So the Buddha comes across as a serene figure, as a person who got it together. He died comfortably in the arms of his cousin and disciple Ananda. And what they were on to say is that the secret to all this is to forget yourself entirely In fact, they worked out a metaphysical system that says that the idea that we are a self at all is illusion. In fact, that's the greatest illusion of all for the Buddhists, is that there is a self. That there's this self that's interacting with the world. They say that isn't right. That is an illusion. That's the doctrine of anatma. No self. There is no self. They say that's an illusion. And you got to get rid of that notion of this self. If I could try to make any sense out of that, I would liken it to Paul's statement, I live now, no longer I, but Christ lives in me. I live, no longer I, but Christ lives in me. The reduction, you must die to yourself in order to rise to new life. But the metaphysical doctrine is something that we in East are never going to get a hold of or make sense out of, I don't think. I mean, I just don't think we got the categories of the outlook to really accomplish that. That's part of what it is. But it has sort of an ethical dimension. This reduction of the ego, this reduction of desire. And again, I'll repeat one of my favorite Buddhist parables that people have no doubt heard me say many times, but they can be repeated. And that is, this is of the famous monk Gutai, living in a particular village. Gutai was an upright and honest man. He had the respect of every person in the village. And one day there was a young girl in the village who got pregnant. And she didn't want to tell her folks or anyone else who the father was. And so she said, Gutai is the father of this child. Well, the parents were irate. And they went to Gutai and they said, how could you do that? You're supposed to be a monk. How could you act like that? And Gutai looked at them and said, is that so? And the townspeople were down on Gutai. We can't have this hypocrite living in our midst anymore. We must throw him out. So they come up to Gutai and say, you have to get out of here. You have to leave. And Gutai looks at them and says, is that so? Many years pass. Finally, the young girl conscience bothers her. She can no longer contain herself. And she tells her parents. And word gets around the town that Gutai indeed was not the father. Didn't have anything to do with it. Been falsely persecuted. And so they go to Gutai, exiled outside the village, and they say, we're terribly sorry. It's all been a mistake. We're sorry what we did. They apologize all over the place. And Gutai looks at them and says, is that so? Well, this is sort of a psychological or ethical way of trying to get at the no-self doctrine of what the Buddhists are talking about, this self-forgetfulness. In other words, the man has put aside his ego. He's able to deal with these faults. It doesn't bother him. He's got a tranquil spirit. He's too composed, too together, too self-confident to let mere problems like being accused in this way of bothering him. He's able to let go of all of that. One of Merton's favorite stories along this line was of the Zen master who happened to look out one day or one night and he saw a young man up in his tree stealing his fruit from his tree. So what did the Zen master do? Went into his garage and got a ladder. Went and put the ladder under the tree and snuck back into his house so the young man could climb down and not hurt himself getting out of the tree. Merton liked that story again of this same thing. I mean, you begin to get a feeling for what this is all about. There's a letting go of various things. There's a letting go of possession. There's a letting go of self. Another one of my favorite Buddhist parables is the one about the two monks. They're walking along, and Buddhist monks are not to have any contact with women at all. And they're walking along in a riverbed, and here comes this beautiful young girl along, and she has to get across the river. She stops and says, well, I have to get across the river. I have no boat. So one of the monks picked her up and carried her through the water across the river and put her on the other side. Well, two monks were walking along, and many miles, nothing said, usual silence, walking along. Finally, the other monk who had witnessed this whole parable thing could contain himself no longer and said, "How could you do that? How could you take that beautiful girl in your arms like that? How could you lower yourself like that and do that, break your vows?" And the other monk looked at him and said, "Well," he said, "I picked her up and took her across the river and I put her down on the other side. You're still carrying her in your head." Of letting go. Letting go mentally. A statement again about self-consciousness, about how that gets in the way, how the consciousness can continue to mess up one's perceptions and thinking, and even mess up relationships. You have to get beyond that if one is going to function in some better way. In Merton's last talk, he told the story of the two abbots. One abbot was in a tough political situation, didn't know what to do. And so he writes a note to a neighboring abbot, lays out the plant problem, says, what advice do you give me? The abbot sends back a note. The abbot opens up and reads and says, "From now on, everyone stands on his own feet." And Merton says that's the story today. And what we've got to do is develop this inner strength, this self-understanding, this ability to trust our own experience. That's what we have to end up doing. Everyone stands on their own 2 feet now. No one's around to tell us what to do. No one's around to answer all the questions. Everyone, without exception, now has to stand on their own 2 feet. And so we begin to get rid of the false consciousness. The consciousness that says someone else is going to solve my problem. Someone else is wiser than I am. Someone else knows all the answers. I wait for the authority figure to figure out what I really am supposed to do. From now on, everyone stands on their own 2 feet. Well, that's Merton's encounter with Zen. That's doing it through the story. Another way to do it is to say what Merton was getting out of all of this. And what Merton was interested in Buddhism was especially Zen. Now, Zen occurred when the Buddhism taught in India by Siddhartha Gautama eventually encountered the Chinese thought of people in the Taoist tradition, and it produced what they called Zen. That's a Japanese word. Zazen means sitting. So because the monks sat down to do their meditation, they began to talk about Zen. And Merton's approach to Zen was this, not like it was another religion, like here's Catholicism and here's Zen Buddhism, but for him, Zen was like a way of being, a way of consciousness that was not judgmental, that was open, and that tried to get at reality as it really is. The reason the Zen masters would tell the koan, what's the sound of one hand clapping, because there's no answer to it. And as you begin to look through your own frame, you say, well, what does that mean? And the design was to clear away the clutter, to clear away the stereotypical thinking, the ordinary way of viewing reality, so that one could see reality whole and clear. So Merton says that Zen really isn't a religion, it's like a mirror, a clear mirror, and whatever you put in front of it, it will reflect. And that's what he got out of Suzuki. His whole correspondence with him was put away the preconceived notions, put away the ego and all that, and let reality be. Don't be judgmental, drink it in. Or you could say a lot more about what he tried to get out of Zen, but that becomes, I would say, the major idea, the major essential point that at least Merton found in that particular Buddhist tradition. Let me take, we're going to end in 5 minutes or so here. Contrary to the plea of those who asked me to end at 9, I've gone over. But, otherwise you're going to miss the story. Anybody want to ask or comment or fill in on that? Yes, sure.
Just an observation from my view when we were talking about the ideal response. It seems in the language that tonight, we're going to need really self-conscious in that mood. And then soon all the other people have to be self-conscious who were in part of the ideal response.
Yes, yeah, just to fill out the comment that Sheila made, we're talking about Merton's own problem of self-consciousness. I mean, it's not unusual that he searched out the East. I mean, he had, he was like Tolstoy. I mean, his mind is working all the time, and all these things are going on. And he found it difficult very often to relate to people. He's very sarcastic very often in the way he related to people, and he used that kind of humor to put people off very often. So, he had difficulty. And then you were talking about the romantic relationship he had with the young student nurse and so on, as being, maybe another way of looking at the truth that we find tonight. And I think that, as we know, in that relationship, he ended up very disquieted. He's searching, and when the abbot finally made him break it off, his idea was, I'm not going to get the quote just right, some of you can help me, but it's like, he says to her, we're like two half-selves now wandering around in the world. And so he is very, disquieted in a way. He can't get his heart to rest. He can't really get all of that together. He's in this search for the eternal feminine, as I talked about it. And I think then what we see now here is really a step beyond that, and it's one that occurs, in a short period of time, when he moves into this new sort of understanding, where he has the great religious experiences with the Buddhist figures, gets a certain peacefulness, and then I think is able to relate it in the lectures he gives after that, his final lectures, to the whole Christian outlook on things. And it finally gets down to being able to translate all of that back into a framework that we can understand, and that, I'm using your point out as a springboard to do that, and that is that the travel to the East, the interest in the East, the reading of Zen Buddhism or Chuang Tzu or whatever it is, for most of us becomes a corrective.